Looking back, I feel dumb. Completely stupid, actually. I should have known that apartment was far too cheap to be right, even for a studio. I should have known that there had to be a catch. The day that I moved in was a complete blur. I insisted that no one help me, not wanting to prove any of my family members' suspicions about my character. By late afternoon, all my muscles ached terribly and my head throbbed. I fell back on my bare mattress, staring up at the ceiling fan with glazed over eyes. I pulled the damp strands of hair from my sweaty forehead, wincing in disgust. Somebody knocked on my door, causing me to jump. I cursed under my breath, pushing myself up on my elbows. 2 girls were peeking around my doorframe. Foolishly, I had left it wide open, forgetting the old college rule. Only leave your door open if you want to make new friends. And I was not in the mood to make new friends. One of them, an Asian girl with choppy black hair, was grinning at me. The other stood a little further back, playing with a box of Marlboro Reds. "Hey," she said, and nodding at me. Her voice was smooth and raspy at the same time. "Did you just move in?" I laid back down, rubbing my face with both hands, choosing not to bother with manners. "Yeah, about 5 seconds ago." "Cool." The girl walked in, evidently ignoring my very clear body language. The girl with the black hair ran her fingers along the edge of my desk, and then picked up a little ceramic duck from my unpacked box of trinkets. "Grandma," I explained, feeling strangely defensive. "Cute," she replied, holding it up to her face. "Has anybody told you yet?" The other girl asked abruptly, looking around my apartment. She had tucked the cigarettes into her back pocket and was now tugging at her long red braids. "Jesus, Gianna, give her a second." "Well, she needs to know." "Yeah, but we haven't even asked her name." I blinked at the 2 strangers incredulously. I hadn't even had time to put toilet paper in my bathroom, and here they were, touching my things and talking about me like I wasn't there. I just wanted to take a nap, honestly. "My name's Arden," I said. The girl with the red braids, Gianna, sat down next to me on my bed. "So did they tell you?" "Tell me what?" "Oh, of course they didn't. The rules." I blinked again, my face blank. I didn't know about any rules besides the typical renting ones. I had signed the lease after at best, skimming over it. The landlord was a skinny woman who smelled of ashes, and I was fairly certain that she had never developed the facial muscles necessary for smiling. I wasn't about to ask her any follow-up questions, especially when the rent was so cheap. The other girl laughed nervously. "Where did you move here from?" I ignored her. "What rules?" Gianna got a strange, wicked sort of smile on her face, bouncing a little on my mattress. The other girl sighed loudly. "Something happens here every night." She began, pulling out my rickety office chair and sitting down. "Something weird." "Well, like what?" I sat up, frowning at her. Finally, my interest was piqued. "Someone walks down the street," Gianna said. Her voice reminded me of a camp counselor telling a scary story around the bonfire. "That one, right down there." She pointed at my window. "It's someone different each night. They scream for help for about an hour, but we aren't supposed to help them." I just stared at her. I felt a small chill run up my spine. I didn't know what to make of all this. "It happens at a different time every night," the other one said softly. "We never know when it's coming." "Why?" She shrugged almost sadly. "We don't know why." I scoffed, leaning my elbows against my knees. "I don't believe you." The girl shrugged. "You don't have to. You'll see for yourself." The look in her eyes made me want to believe her. She seemed sincere, but I couldn't even begin to fathom what they were saying being true. It was all too strange, too outlandish. I knew this wouldn't be the nicest neighborhood, but it couldn't be that bad. It had to be a prank. They had to be hazing me or something. "We'll come back later," Gianna said matter-of-factly. "We'll show you." Before I could protest, she grabbed the other girl by the wrist and they were gone. I followed them to the door, watching them march down the hall, talking to each other in hushed voices. I closed my door behind them. That night, as promised, they came back. They came dragging along two boys. One was somewhat muscular, wearing a tight black t-shirt and baggy jeans, and my eyes were instantly drawn to a silver heart-shaped locket around his neck. He smiled at me and introduced himself as Will when he walked in. The other boy was smaller but chubbier and nervous-looking, with a buzz cut and ill-fitting cargo shorts. His name, I was told, was Mateo. The girl named Gianna came in carrying a bottle of wine and that same slightly crumpled box of cigarettes. The other one, the girl I still didn't know the name of, was the only one who looked even somewhat apologetic. They all sat down on my dusty floor next to the window, and they motioned for me to join them. I sat between Will and the nameless girl, unsure whether I should continue feeling violated or if I should just give in to my strange and pushy neighbors. "Do you all live in this building?" I asked, hesitantly accepting the wine when it was passed to me. "Yeah," Will answered with a grin. It seemed half-hearted. "This building is where all the young people live." "It's where they put us." Gianna cut in, lighting a cigarette. It didn't even occur to me to tell her not to smoke inside. We've all been sorted out. "Oh, forgive her, she's a bit of a conspiracy theorist." "Hey, it's not a theory," she snapped, glaring at him. "Look at the other ones next door, the middle-agers. People with kids but no grandkids. Across the street, old people. Not a single 20-something in that entire building. May, tell him." So her name was May. I looked her over, admiring her smoky eye makeup and how she had tied her hair up, long strands poking out like exploding fireworks. "Stop it," May muttered, reaching for the wine bottle. "You're gonna scare her." "I'm not scared." She just shrugged at me as if she didn't believe me. We passed the bottle around and then around again. I listened to them bicker and laugh. It was clear that they had all been friends for a while, and I felt a little bit like I was intruding, even though they were in my apartment. Will asked me if I had gone to college, and I told him that I did, but I dropped out. They all nodded sympathetically, which made me feel stupid. By midnight, I was a little bit buzzed and my guard was beginning to fall. I had to admit it felt good to have friends. I had already mentally resigned myself to a life of solitude, at least for a while, but it seemed that might not actually have to be my fate. I laughed at Mateo and Gianna's drunken argument, passing a cigarette back and forth with May, blowing the smoke out of my open window. I had almost completely forgotten why they were all over when it happened. All at once, a blaring alarm came from each of our phones, like an Amber Alert. I could hear the sound echo throughout the neighborhood, like an entire chorus of hundreds of phones going off, not just ours. I nearly leapt out of my skin. Not even Gianna laughed. All of them went quiet, and they looked at me as I took it out, frowning at the screen. "Do not interfere." "It's coming," Will whispered. He had changed, his eyes almost glassy and his voice soft and shaky. Mateo squeezed his shoulder. I looked at May. Her eyebrows were cinched together in concern, and she was stubbing out our cigarette against the windowsill, shrinking away. There it was again, that chill. It crept up my back, spreading along my scalp and making me shiver. Something felt deeply, deeply wrong. The others were quiet now, staring silently at the window that I was sitting up against. The air felt somehow warmer, like it was buzzing with something, or maybe I was just sweating. We sat there unmoving for what felt like half an hour. Right as I was getting tempted to ask what was going on, I heard it. It was far away and faint, but I still heard it. A cry. It continued as it got gradually closer and louder, more desperate. "Help! Please, my God, someone help me!" Slowly, I leaned out the window. I had to see it with my eyes, had to confirm that there was actually somebody out there like they had said there would be. My new apartment was on the 4th floor, so it was hard to see who was down in the street without squinting. In the flickering streetlights, I could make out the outline of an elderly man. He was hunched over, wandering aimlessly from door to door, wearing only what looked like a hospital gown to cover his pale and broken body. And behind him trailed a path of dripping blood, although I couldn't see where it was coming from. "Please, I'm hurt." I looked back at the others, my mouth hanging open. "What is this?" I demanded loudly. "What is this?" May touched my arm, trying to calm me down, and I pulled away from her. "Arden, please. We have to help him. Why can't we help him? He's just an old man." "We can't help him. Trust me." I ignored her, leaning further out the window, prepared to call out to him. But before I could open my mouth, I froze. The man down there was still now, facing our building. His head was tilted upwards and I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew that he was looking right at me. I immediately felt cold, like I was plummeting into ice water. "Help me," he whimpered into the silent night air, his voice barely audible. And then he began to scream. That scream wasn't human, or at least not any human that I had ever met. It was desperate and agonized. It made my stomach turn and my eyes prick with tears. I couldn't look away. The blood was coming from his arms, or I should say his lack of arms. Where his arms should have been, there was only bloody and mangled stumps. They looked fresh. He didn't move other than in a shaky sway, and his eyes didn't leave me. His shriek slowly molded into words that I could just barely understand. "Please, please." May yanked me backwards away from the window. I landed on my butt and yelped in pain and horror. "What is that thing?" I whispered. I didn't mean to whisper, but that was all that came out. "We don't know," May replied, her eyes trained on Will, who was crying now. Mateo held onto him like he might topple over. "We just know to follow the rules." "What happens if you don't follow the rules?" I asked and immediately regretted it. Will sobbed softly. Outside, the old man wailed. Gianna reached over and pulled the window shut, but it somehow did nothing to muffle the blood-curdling sound. "Do you want to tell her, or should I?" Mateo asked Will. Will just shook his head. He was clutching his locket now, turning the little heart over between his fingers. Mateo sighed and turned towards me. "A couple of months ago, one of them got to Will's girl. Shannon," Gianna butted in. "Her name was Shannon. Her name is Shannon." I swallowed, but whatever I did, nothing would force down the lump in my throat. "What happened?" Mateo shook his head. "We don't know. We were all together when the screaming had started. Usually we just ignore it now, you know. No use in dwelling on it. But that night we think that she saw something different. She started insisting that she had to help and she ran outside. We couldn't stop her." He paused, glancing over at Will. He was silent and still. The screaming outside had begun to pass, getting softer as it continued further down the street. "Well, then what?" He shrugged. "Nothing. She was just gone." I pressed my lips together, trying to process all of this. I really had believed that they were messing with me, but I had seen it. I had witnessed it firsthand, and it terrified me. "Why doesn't anyone leave?" He shrugged for a second time. "Can't afford it, or people just don't care. Some people have left, but we all signed an NDA with the lease, so nobody ever knows." I frowned, thinking back to signing the paperwork and trying to remember. I could vaguely picture what he was talking about. I just assumed it was more legal jargon that I would never understand. Had I seriously signed a non-disclosure agreement without even noticing? After that, I told them that I wanted to go to bed. I needed time to process all of this. They understood, and each one of them said goodbye before leaving me alone. As I lay in the dark staring at the ceiling, for some strange reason I thought of May's face when we had realized it was happening. How she had put out the cigarette and backed away from the window. Eventually, I was able to drift off to sleep. The next few weeks were difficult. I spent more and more time with my new neighbors. I came to find that they were right. I didn't think there was a single person older than 30 in our entire building, but I saw them all the time leaving the one next door. Settling in was difficult. The others seemed so used to it. They cared, of course, it scared them, especially Will. But you could tell that they had been here a while by the way that they sighed, closed the blinds, and focused harder on what they were doing. Eventually, I began to mimic them. It helped a little bit to pretend that it was normal, as strange as that sounds. Moving out wasn't really an option for me anyways. I was a college dropout and I hadn't found a job yet. I was still just getting by on what I had managed to save up. Every night it was someone different. Some were more human, some seemed less. Some were drenched in blood, their clothes ripped and strange, but some looked fairly normal. The worst were the children. They would run like injured chickens, screeching and banging on doors, begging for help. Sometimes they would try different things, say different things, like, "They're coming. I don't want to die. I'm sorry." There were a lot of children. One night while I was half awake, an alarm went off. It wasn't like the one on our phones. It was blaring, only somewhat muffled by my window. My apartment glowed a flashing red from outside. I didn't even look. I was too scared of what I might see. I just covered my head with my pillow and I tried to fall back asleep. I came to learn all of the theories, especially from Gianna. She thought that we had all been chosen and predetermined to live here, all for some sick little government game. She thought maybe there were people betting on the different buildings, putting down money on who would interfere the least. "You see that?" she said to me one day in the hallway, returning from a coffee run. Cameras everywhere. I didn't know if I believed her. I spent time with May mostly. We smoked on the front steps and people watched. It was strange to see what at night was such a sinister and gruesome neighborhood, but during the day bright and lively. She didn't talk much about the rules, and so I didn't either. We didn't talk all that much in general, I found, just enjoying each other's company. Right when I was beginning to feel comfortable was when it happened. It started with a birthday cake. "Happy birthday." As May walked through the door, Mateo blew into his plastic party horn. The paper inflated, smacking Will on the side of the head. May's hand flew to her heart. "Jesus Christ, you know I hate surprises." Gianna laughed and walked over to her. In her hands, she held a chocolate cake, haphazardly adorned with sprinkles and bright pink icing that read, "Happy Birthday, May," in the center. 24. She set down the cake on the dresser and threw her arm around May's neck. "How does it feel?" "Awful." "Now that's the spirit." Enough of this, Mateo cut in, weaving between them. "Hey, let's eat some cake and then let's go." Their tradition, I had learned, was to bar hop for birthdays. They told me that there was no curfew here despite the rules, just a recommended time to be home, which was at 10:30 p.m. Usually, they said, they got home before the alarm, or they spent the night out somewhere else. We all took some cake. The boys took shots in the kitchen to pregame while I watched Gianna fuss over May's hair. I was never much of a partier. While at clubs or bars in college, I spent most of the time out back, chatting with the smokers. But then again, I was never much of a friend group person either, so maybe the circumstances were changing. I watched them all troop outside to Mateo's car. I stuffed myself in the back, incredibly conscious of how close I was pressed into May. My other shoulder rammed into the car door. Mateo's music, cranked up to maximum volume, hurt my ears, and the tiny space was packed with the smell of tobacco and various perfumes as we sped down the freeway toward the city. But it was nice. It was really nice. I found myself laughing with them, and I hooked my arm around May's when she weaseled her hand beneath my elbow. It was actually nice. As predicted, the bars they chose weren't exactly my scene, but this time, as opposed to college, I could stand it. I took shots, I followed them out for smoke breaks, I even danced under the low purple lights until my feet ached inside my chunky heels, surely riddled with blisters. By the time that we got to our third bar, I couldn't even feel it anymore. And it was at that third bar that we crammed ourselves into an old photo booth, and Gianna reluctantly offered $5 to the slot, and we laughed, red-faced, into a tiny camera. After the photos spit out into the compartment, the others slid through the red curtains, but before I could follow, May grabbed my wrist. She held me back, sliding her long baby blue nails up my wrist. I shivered. "You never gave me a birthday present," she whispered, and I could feel her breath on my face. If I was wearing my glasses, they would have been fogging up. Yeah, well, I didn't get to finish my quip before she kissed me. It was nice, and then it wasn't. "Hey," Will called out to me, squeezing through a crowd of men wearing tattered leather jackets to get to me. "Arden, where's everybody else?" I blinked, looking around. I could have sworn that they had been right there a second ago, but now none of them were anywhere to be found. I shrugged. "I don't know. Why, what's up?" He finally broke free from the swaying mass, and I could get a better look at him. He looked worried. His face was flushed, and I could see a few drops of sweat creeping out from his hairline. He took his phone out of his pocket and held it out to me. First, I saw his home screen. It was him sitting next to a girl with strawberry blonde hair, both clutching beer bottles and grinning widely at the camera. And then I looked where he actually wanted me to. The time. 1:47 a.m. "It's getting late," he narrated. "Can we find the others and get going?" I understood then. He was worried. It was past 1 a.m. and no alarm yet. It was later than usual. The bars would be closing soon, and he wanted to get back before it happened. Will and I weaved through the crowd. I was pretty buzzed, and I realized that I was having a hard time moving my feet right, which made me feel embarrassed. I hadn't even had that much to drink. Was I that much of a lightweight? We found them outside, chain smoking. Will explained the situation while I swayed. The drive back was strangely tense. Mateo's music was turned down, and there wasn't any joking or boisterous gossiping like there had been on the way out. We all felt it, and it didn't need to be said. Something was off. Will drove fast, almost reckless. In the dark, May took my hand. Just as he was careening around the last corner, and we could almost make out the shape of our apartment building down the street, it happened. All of our phones went off at once. Gianna let out a small shriek from the other side of the back seat. "Do not interfere." Mateo turned back towards us, pressing his finger to his lips. Had this ever happened before? By their reactions, I didn't think so. It was different when it came when I was in my bedroom, when I could just shut the curtains and put my headphones on. I felt so small and helpless then, like I was gazing into the maw of something incomprehensible beyond my understanding. I felt like we were all flies, and this neighborhood right now was the spider's web. Will drove slowly now, maybe 5 miles an hour. We were all still and we were all silent. Not even a stray breath cut through the quiet. Underneath the glowing streetlights, I could make out the side of Will's face. He was pale, and if I hadn't seen his knees shifting as he pressed down on the brakes, I could have mistaken him for a mannequin. The car came to a stop. I followed his gaze all the way down the street to the dark horizon, and I saw what he saw. A silhouette. It was far too distant to make out what shape it took, but it was evidently humanoid. It moved in a shaky stumble, limping down the middle of the road in our direction, and in the overwhelming silence I could hear it, far away but still deeply urgent. "Help me." "Will," Gianna hissed, "turn the car around." Will didn't move. He just stared forward, as white as paper. It didn't make any logical sense, but I knew what he knew. It was too late now. There was no use. "Help me. Please help." I could tell now that it was a girl from its voice, and its figure as it got closer. It was wearing some sort of white nightgown, not unlike the old man's hospital attire from the first night, stained with dark red blood. From here I couldn't tell if it was fresh or dry. I didn't know why that mattered to me. "Maybe," May whispered, her arms shook against mine. "Maybe if we're quiet and we duck down, it won't see us." And deep down, it felt as hopeless as turning around it felt, but it seemed reasonable. I nodded and did as she suggested, crouching behind the passenger seat, my knees throbbing from the strange angle that I had bent myself into. We all did it except for Will. He didn't move, he still just looked. When he finally spoke, I could barely hear him, it was so weak. "Shannon." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mateo was the one to break the silence. "What?" "Shannon," he repeated, finally turning to look at his friend. "That's Shannon." I peered over the seat in front of me, squinting my eyes. The human-like thing was getting closer, and now I could make out strawberry blonde hair, a round face, short legs. The girl from Will's phone lock screen. The girl who had disappeared. "Shannon." May gasped next to me. "Dude," Mateo said slowly, his words crumbling as soon as they left his mouth. "I know what you're thinking, dude. Do not get out of this car." Will didn't even seem like he was with us anymore. He was in shock, I think, looking back. "I have to help her," he insisted, right as another sickening cry rang out. "Help me! Help! Help somebody! It hurts!" It was getting far too close to us for comfort, but it still didn't seem to notice the car. Its cries became more and more desperate as they got louder. "I have to help her," Will repeated, and a bit of life had returned to his face. Mateo shook his head and grabbed at his sleeve. "Will, that is not Shannon." Will glared at him, his eyes shining with tears. "I know Shannon, and that's her." "I know you do, dude, and I know you miss her, but please, please don't do this." Their voices were getting louder and more distraught, and I felt May press into my side, trembling like a leaf. Gianna was whimpering, but I couldn't see her from my position. The thing was almost to our car when it stopped. She turned her head left and then right, almost like she was sniffing the air. The boys stopped arguing, and I felt like my heart would burst out of my chest. I could see Shannon's face now, and I realized why she hadn't seen us. The girl's face was streaked with red, and it looked like her eyes had been scooped out with a melon spoon. She cried, drool pouring from her slackened mouth, but no tears could come. It happened too quickly. None of us could stop him. Will violently ripped his arm away from Mateo, fumbling for the handle to the car door. Gianna screamed, and Mateo tried to slam down on the lock, but he missed, and Will managed to get the door open before he could try again. He stumbled onto the asphalt and hit the ground with a soft crunch. The thing turned her head and began to scream, but instead of charging at Will, she backed away. She held her arms out in front of her like something might attack her, whipping her head around wildly. An alarm went off like the one that I had heard that one night, but far more unbearable now that I was in it. The streetlights lining either side of the street switched to a flashing red, and Mateo threw himself into the driver's seat, the tires screeching as he peeled away. Gianna was screaming at him, pleading with him to go back. May was weeping into her hands. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I didn't understand. As we sped away, I looked back. I couldn't help it. I saw the flash of some sort of van in the blinding red light pulling around the corner, and then nothing. That was a week or two ago, I don't know. I've been having a hard time keeping track of time. None of us have spoken much since that night. We tried the police, of course, but as you could assume, nothing came of it. I think whatever this is far larger than we know. I don't know if it's some kind of experiment or just a sick game, but I'm going to move back into my parents' house next week, despite all their berating, and then figure out what to do from there. I don't know if that was really Shannon that we saw that night, or if it was something else, and I don't know which is worse. All I know is that last night, I heard Will's voice outside my window, crying and pleading for help. I didn't interfere. A lot has happened since the last time that I wrote, and I feel that you all deserve to know what happened. I don't know if I can ever explain it, but I'll try. Hey Arden, there's somebody on the phone for you. Would you come here? I looked up from the book that I had been pretending to read, resting against my folded up legs. I often found myself in this position these days, sitting in my parents' kitchen on the window nook, crumpled up as tightly as I could manage. Every morning my back ached like I had aged 40 years overnight. My mother stood in the doorway, tapping her foot impatiently. She did it like she thought I would think that she was being subtle, one hand on her hip and the other clutching her boxy landline phone. I blinked in surprise. On the landline? Not everybody has a fancy new cell phone, Arden. Now take it, my hand is cramping up. I was surprised at how easy it had been to move out of the apartment, but I wasn't surprised my parents had let me move back in. I expected more pushback from our landlord, but my parents, my mother specifically, it was like she was always waiting for me to prove her right. When I told her that I was coming home, she sighed, and I swore that I could hear the hint of a smile in her tone. Oh, what happened now, honey? But I knew I couldn't complain, and she knew it too. I had reached the end of the line. There was nothing else to do. And after what I saw, I wasn't sure if I could ever live alone again, frankly. I stood and walked over to her, thanking her under my breath and taking the phone. She huffed and marched off, and I was left there alone staring at the receiver, my face slack. It was like I knew before I even brought it up to my ear. Hello? Who is this? Hey, Arden. Her voice was angry, a hint of red-hot frustration weaving between each punchy letter, but there was something else in there too. I felt my face go pale. Sorry to call you like this. You haven't been answering your cell, so I found this number in the phone book. And guilt stabbed at my gut like a hot poker. I glanced over at my cell phone, which sat on the kitchen table. I knew it had been wrong, but I had blocked all of their numbers the day after I got out of there. I didn't want to think about it, about any of it. I didn't want any connection to that cursed place. Hi, Gianna. Yeah, hi, she snapped, sounding more annoyed by the second. Look, I know that you had to leave, I get that. We would too if that was an option. She trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid, but heavily implied. I was simply luckier than they were. But you need to come back. What? I exclaimed, louder than I meant to. I winced, only continuing when I heard no angry shout to quiet down from the other room. What? Why? She sighed loudly, and it was like I could hear her face sinking. I could hear her resolve slipping and her feet pacing around her room. I knew that something had to be wrong, something worse than what had already been wrong, something big. It's May, she said finally, and my heart jumped. The hot poker in my stomach twisted. Listen, I can't explain it over the phone, I just need you to come back. It's important. I faltered. I felt my eyes sting. As soon as I had left, I knew that I could never come back. I could never associate myself with that place ever again. Nothing about that neighborhood made any sense to me. I didn't trust it. I didn't even know if I could trust Gianna. But May... The day I left, her eyes were still swollen. She hadn't stopped weeping since Will had been taken. "Don't go," she said to me. She couldn't even look at me, her head bowed, sitting motionless on her bed. "I'm sorry. Something bad will happen if you go, I just feel it. Please don't go, Arden." I knew, I just didn't want to know. I knew if something had happened to May, I had to go back. There was no choice, no third option. It was my fault. "Arden," Gianna said after the silence had hung in the air between us for a good minute. "Please." "Okay, I'll come back." "Good, great. Just be subtle, okay? They're everywhere right now." I heard the phone click, my mouth hanging open to reply, to ask what she had meant by that. By the time that I had reached the neighborhood, dusk was creeping across the skyline. I felt a shiver run up my spine, recalling vividly what had happened here at night. As I drove down our old street at 20 miles an hour, I felt something strange. I felt like I was being watched. When I turned my head, curtains pulled shut. People ducked back behind their doors. Everything was just out of my sight in the corner of my eye. It was even eerier here than it had been when I left, which I hadn't thought possible. Gianna met me in front of the apartment building, sitting on the steps and smoking a cigarette between pale and trembling fingers. By the pile of ash and butts beside her, I could tell that it wasn't her first. Her red hair was down and frizzy like she hadn't brushed it in a while, and her eyes looked small and puffy. When I parked and got out of the car, she slowly raised her head to look up at me. I couldn't read her expression as she stood, and it occurred to me that she might hit me or strangle me, or both. "Gianna, She cut me off, pulling me into the tightest hug of my life. I swore that I could hear my own ribs crack. Her wool scarf scratched against my neck and her hair stuck to my chapstick. "Thank you for coming back," she muttered into my ear. "Screw you for leaving." I laughed dryly, patting her back awkwardly. "I deserve that." She finally pulled away and I tried to gasp for breath as subtly as possible. Jesus, that girl was strong. She smiled at me weakly, readjusting her jacket. "Come on, come inside. I know she'll be happy to see you." I froze, my eyebrows cinching into a frown, my heart pounding in my chest. Wait, May's here? She wasn't taken. Gianna glanced back at me as she mounted the stairs, pressing her lips tightly together. No, she was. When we got upstairs, Gianna unlocked her door and looked around, her eyes flickering up and down the hallway. I wanted to ask, but I knew better than to do it there. She pushed the door open just enough for us to slip inside, and I followed her lead. I heard her lock the door again behind us as I stared, wide-eyed at her apartment. It was a mess. There was almost nothing that wasn't broken, shards of pottery, flower stems, and glass coating the wooden floor. Anything that wasn't bolted down was strewn across the room. The walls were streaked with something that looked suspiciously like dried blood. In the corner of the room, Mateo was hunched in front of someone. His hair had grown out a bit and it was looking shaggy, and he seemed like he had lost a bit of weight. "Hey, it's okay, it's okay. It's just Gianna and Arden. You remember Arden, don't you?" I heard a choked, whimpering sound and then a gurgle. I stood there in front of the door, unable to move, unable to say or do anything. Mateo shifted, turning back to look at us, and I saw her. I saw her, but she didn't see me. May sat in the corner, hugging her knees, which were riddled with bruises and scrapes. She was wearing a blue hospital gown, and she rocked back and forth in strange and jerky motions. "Help," she whispered, her voice raspy and painful sounding. "Help, help me." Her black hair that was so silky and perfect before was wild now, missing patches, leaving bright red speckled spots of skin behind. Her face was swollen almost in a way that it had been the day I left, and smeared with fresh blood, and her eyes. She had no eyes. "May," I choked out, forcing sound to leave my throat. I turned away and bent over, heaving and gagging over the pile of shattered ceramics. Gianna placed a hand on my back. "She went after Will," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her palm making small circles between my shoulder blades. "A few days after you went home, we heard him out there again. He was calling us by name. She couldn't take it." I gagged again, but nothing would come out. Another gurgling moan came from the corner, growing into a whine. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her start to pull at her hair, and Mateo grabbed her wrists. "How? Why is she here?" Gianna took a shaky breath. I went a little crazy when she was taken. I slept in the lobby every night, just waiting for her to come back. When I finally heard her out there a week or so later, Mateo and I ran out there and grabbed her. That white van came, but we managed to get her inside before they caught us. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly painfully dry. Gianna glanced around the room as if someone might be listening to us. "They saw us," she mumbled, hugging herself. "Obviously, they saw us take her, and there are cameras everywhere. They know that we have her, but nobody has come for us. It's like they're waiting for something." May let out a sob, writhing in Mateo's grip. "Help! Please help me, it hurts." My lip trembled. I stood up straight, holding out my hand and creeping toward her. "Hey, May." I bit my lip, fighting back tears. May trembled and rocked, her head tilted vaguely in my direction. Where her eyes had been, there were only holes. Like Shannon. They did the same thing to her that they did to Shannon. It had to be some kind of message. "It's me, Arden. I'm here now. I came back." "Oh, and there's one more thing," Gianna said, and I felt her eyes watching me, cautious. "The screaming. It stopped. They don't come anymore, the people begging for help. But every night..." Right as she trailed off, the alarm rang out, more deafening than ever. Red lights flashed, flooding the apartment in crimson. I was struck with a deeply familiar fear, the same fear that I had felt my first night here. It made my bones ache and my ears ring. May whipped her head around, her body tensing. She began to whine louder and louder as if she were a dog howling along to ambulance sirens. Mateo immediately reached to cover her mouth with his hand, but after only a second he shouted in pain and pulled away, his fingers trickling blood. "May, it's okay," Gianna cried. I started towards her again, reaching out to take her in my arms, but I only made it a few steps before she charged at me. May tackled me to the ground and I landed with a loud thud. I reached for her wrists as she screamed and thrashed, but in her desperation, she overpowered me. I felt her fingernails dig into my face, scratching at me like a frightened animal, inching up towards my eyes. I screamed, trying to squirm away from her. Finally, Gianna and Mateo took her by either arm, hauling her off of me. I sat up, breathing heavy, and I touched my face. It stung and my fingertips came back stained red. May slumped over, still being held up by her friends. I took a few last gulping breaths, just looking at her, trembling. And then I crawled forward, carefully wrapping my arms around her. She protested weakly, but not for long. After a moment, she went completely limp, letting me hold her, sobbing wetly in my ear. I reached up, petting her hair, careful to avoid the spots where she had ripped it out. "It's okay," I whispered, squeezing my eyes shut so that my tears couldn't fall. "I'm sorry for leaving you. I was a coward. I'm so sorry." I held her like that, cradling her until the alarm finally stopped. The quiet that came after was almost more unbearable, making everything still. My head ached. "Are you gonna stay the night?" Mateo asked me finally, and he sat down beside us. Gianna followed suit. Yeah, of course I will. I sighed, opening my eyes to look at them. Can I stay with her? I was hoping that you would ask, Gianna said with a weak smile. We're exhausted. Would you mind if you stayed here and Mateo and I slept over at his place? I shook my head, and Gianna squeezed my shoulder. Thanks, Arden, really. Tomorrow we can think of something, but tonight I just really need some sleep. Mateo nodded in agreement. I realized both of their eyes drooped with dark purple bags beneath them. Yeah, tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll think of something. After we said our goodnights, I carefully put May in the bed. She was silent now and still beside the shaking. I took a wet rag and very carefully cleaned up her face. When the blood was gone, I could almost recognize her again. I brushed her hair away from her face, staring into the place where her eyes had been. I still felt wary. It was hard to believe it was really her sitting in front of me. Maybe it wasn't, none of us could know. Maybe she really had been transformed into some kind of creature. But in the chance that it was her, I wasn't going to let her sleep alone, not again. I rested my forehead against hers and she let me, drooling into her own lap. I'm so sorry, I told her again. I should have stayed, I'm such a coward. She opened her mouth and closed it again like a fish, like she wanted to say something but she couldn't. I felt the tears coming again and now I let them fall. When I finally drifted off to sleep, May pressed against my side, still shaking. I dreamed of Will. I dreamed that he was outside, standing in front of the building, staring up at our window. His eyes wide and his jaw dropped open in a silent scream. But when I woke up and ran to the window, nobody was there. Okay, I said, taking the cup of coffee that Gianna handed me, smiling at her gratefully. I know what to do. After one night, Mateo asked, eyeing May warily. She was crouched over, tapping her head against the ground slowly in a rhythmic thunk. I shrugged. Do either of you have any ideas? They both shook their heads, glancing at each other. I took a sip of my coffee. Hear me out then. May hit her head against the floor a little quicker, a little harder, letting out a low groan. Help me, help me. I'll take her, I continued, reaching out to touch her shoulder. She flinched away from me as if I had burned her. I'll take her out there when the alarm starts and I'll let them take me. Mateo and Gianna both stared at me, their mouths open. I felt my stomach twist again, but this time not out of guilt, out of fear. I pushed it down, not wanting to let it take over me again. No, Arden, oh my God, you can't do that. They'll mutilate you or kill you or something. I shrugged again, avoiding their eyes. Thunking, May's head continued to hit the floor. I tried to gently pull her back. I don't know what else there is to do. I want to know, don't you? Gianna shook her head quickly, crossing her arms. Not badly enough for that. Besides, if you do that, then we'll never know. You'll come back like May. Gianna glared at me, huffing. Yeah, like May or Will or Shannon, or you won't come back at all. But maybe there's a chance. Maybe I could get them out of wherever they are, like how you saved May. May slammed her head against the floor hard enough to leave a bloody imprint. Mateo grabbed her and put her into a light headlock, restraining her. She screamed, Help me, somebody, help me. We'll come with you, he grunted, raising his voice to be heard over her shouting, wincing from the effort that it was taking to hold her still. No, you can't, you. We'll come with you, he repeated, looking at me pointedly. End of story. Yeah, Gianna chimed in, chewing on her bottom lip. Yeah, that's a good idea, at least that'll give us a better chance. I sighed, taking a slow sip of my coffee. I knew there was no point arguing with them, and to be completely honest, it was comforting to think of them coming with me. I felt like fainting thinking about doing something like that alone. "Fine," I muttered. "Okay, fine, we'll go tonight, okay?" There was silence for a moment. May's whines and pleas for help cutting through it every few seconds. "Yeah, we'll go tonight." Gianna pushed some hair behind her ear and I noticed her hand was shaking. "Deal." "Yeah, and we'll bring them back." "We'll bring them back," Mateo repeated, smiling like he didn't believe it for a second. That was how we ended up in the street. The streetlights flashing a blinding red and the sirens wailing in our ears, ricocheting off every side of my skull and making it feel like my brain was shaking. Gianna held one of my hands and I held May's with the other. Mateo was on the other side of her and together we kept her from attacking anyone or running away or both. I could see the people in the buildings watching us from their windows and from their doors, muttering things that I couldn't hear to each other and shuffling around. I closed my eyes, not wanting the reality of what we were doing to set in and cause me to back out. Right when I started to think that maybe nothing would happen, I heard it. Tires peeling around a corner, the screech of brakes and the smell of exhaust. Gianna squeezed my hand and I heard her whisper, "Oh God," under her breath. I opened my eyes to see 4 men climb out of the van. They were wearing black masks, like ski masks but without any holes, so they could barely even be identified as human, and they had on strange white lab coats. They began to grab us and May screamed and cried frantically, kicking at them as hard as she could as they lifted her off the ground. Gianna held my hand tightly until our fingers went cold and white, even as they tried to pry her away. I heard her crying, and even though this was our plan, I could tell she desperately wanted to fight them and run away as fast as she could. I was feeling the same way. Mateo barely even moved. He let them wrestle him into the van without saying a word, his face cold and still, his jaw tense. The last thing that I remember is Gianna finally being pulled away from me and my body being slammed down against what felt like a gurney. The van sped away alarmingly fast, and a man in another mask approached me, holding a syringe with a long and thick needle. Wait, I choked, holding out my hands, but it was too late. He plunged the needle into the side of my neck, and the whole world spun and dimmed into black. When I opened my eyes, I was in a silent white room. I slowly looked around, my eyes struggling to adjust to the bright light. I looked down at myself and found that I was in a blue hospital gown, lying on top of some kind of stiff white bed. It took me a long moment to remember where I was and why, but when I did, I nearly had to throw up. The room had no windows. It only had the bed, a small metal bedside table, and a door across the room that was the same color as everything else. The only way to identify it as a door was the round silver handle. In the upper right corner, there was a small black camera. Carefully, I swung my legs over the side of the bed. I tested the ground, my knees nearly giving out, but after a moment, I was able to stand up. I shuffled over to the door. I didn't expect it to open, not at all, but it did. After one turn of the knob, I was able to push it open, the door swinging open. I very nearly fell on my face, having not been prepared for it to move. The door opened to a long and carpeted hallway. It buzzed with life, people of all kinds wandering up and down in between rooms, all in hospital gowns talking amongst themselves. I blinked, gazing around warily. A couple of kids sprinted past me, nearly tripping over themselves. I stumbled back, gripping the door frame for support. "Arden!" Somebody shouted from down the hall and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I turned. There stood my friends. Gianna and Mateo were there, as well as another girl with strawberry blonde hair, smiling ear to ear in between them. "Will?" He grinned at me. I instantly forgot about the weakness in my legs, stumbling towards them like a baby deer learning to walk. "Hey, Arden," he said when I was closer, still smiling wide. He wrapped an arm around me and the other one wrapped around the other girl and gave me a squeeze. I pulled away after a second, looking him up and down. No blood, no injuries at all. He seemed perfectly untouched. I squinted at him in suspicion. "What's going on?" He shrugged his shoulders, looking around as if he were seeing it for the first time too. "After I went after Shannon, they brought me here. I was locked in one of those rooms for who knows how long. They gave me food and books to read, but not much else. This is the first time that the doors have been open." "Does that mean?" My voice faded away. He nodded, confirming what I hadn't asked. All of the people around me had been victims. Some of them I could even recognize. I swore one of the old men standing next to a wall speaking to a woman was that man that I had seen on the first night. The one who had looked right back at me and screamed, so blood-curdlingly that I still had nightmares about it. I shivered. "Wait," I whispered as something occurring to me. "Does that mean that?" Somebody tapped my shoulder. I turned slowly, afraid to look. May stood in front of me, her hands clasped behind her back, a shy smile on her face. She was like a snapshot of that first day, the day that I had met her. She fluttered her eyelashes at me, her eyes slightly watery. She was completely fine. A strange groan of relief left my throat, and I enveloped her in my arms, lifting her off the ground and spinning her around. She squealed, laughing and grabbing at my shoulders. As soon as I set her down again, she kissed me, wrapping her arms around my neck. "I missed you so much," she whispered, resting her forehead against mine. I suddenly remembered 2 nights ago doing this very thing with a version of her that had no eyes and could only use her voice to beg for help. I bit my lip, frowning. "This makes no sense." "I know," Gianna said, matching my expression. "I don't understand at all. How could you all be completely fine if we saw you? Who did we rescue if it wasn't actually May?" A voice came over some kind of intercom, crackling to life. Everyone in that hallway froze, turning their heads to the ceiling. May took my hand and squeezed it, and I let her. "Congratulations. The test has been passed. The bystander experiment is complete. You are all free to leave as soon as you sign your paperwork. Thank you." The intercom crackled into silence. The air was heavy and nobody said anything for a long moment. And then someone began to cheer, and then another, and then another. Soon cheering was all that I could hear, bouncing off the walls, the energy electric all around me. My friends hugged me and I hugged them back, nearly sobbing in relief. It finally felt like that first night again, just sitting and smoking and laughing with them, grateful to have friends, before I knew anything about our neighborhood, before I believed them about it. As we began to file towards the exits, my friends bickering about something meaningless, their faces still glowing with wide smiles, I began to feel uneasy. I couldn't stop thinking about the girl that I had thought was May. I had my suspicions, but deep down I had truly believed that it was her. My head whipped to the right as I heard a scratching sound, somehow reaching me over the sounds of all the people in the hallway. I stared at the door that it had come from, its only discerning feature being that metal doorknob. I looked around. My friends didn't seem to even notice that I had stopped, still chatting and laughing to themselves. I slipped away from the crowd, my hands shaking as I reached for the knob. The door slowly creaked open. The room was dim and the stench of blood and excrement immediately punched me in the nose. My eyes stung. I blinked through it, squinting. In the corner of the room, something was hunched over and I could hear soft gasps and sobs. "Help me, please." Its body was somehow bony and globular at the same time, both wrinkled and decrepit and smooth and youthful. It was impossible to describe. It was a mass, an amalgamation, a monster. It turned its head to look at me and I looked back into 1,000 faces all at once. I looked back at blood and broken bones and teeth and pain. I looked back at the old man with the missing arms and the children who squawked like chickens. and Shannon with her missing eyes. I looked back at Will. I looked back at May. Help me. I want to believe what I saw in that room was the real monster. It was whatever we saw each night, taking the forms of our loved ones, and they were all safe in that building the entire time. I want to believe it's maybe something artificial, something made specifically for the purpose of their experiment. I don't want to believe that what I saw was all of them, somehow cosmically smashed together, crammed into the same disgusting figure, able to mold itself into anybody it contains. A tortured slave to whatever government force did all of this. I don't want to believe that May is in there, still blind, still suffering, but I just don't know. What do you think? Damon McCory, Rain, Big Country Allen, Jerry Ramey, MP Massacre 91, Nelson Asada, Die Screaming, Meat Gasher, Justin Fodenauer, Malcolm Black, Dalla Magara, Caden Gibbler, That One Woodsman,